Welcome to the stream, Delian. How you doing?
Yo, what's up? You guys are getting real commercial. I like it.
Oh yeah. The ads never
packed.
stop. The ads never stop. Thank you to the sponsors. You see it.
best-
You see the ticker down there.
The
but
best
we
companies
do
are
ad
hyper
reads constantly.
commercial.
We just did an 8 sleep read.
I know.
So you're welcome.
You should have, by the way, come up on stage when I was, interviewing senators last week at Hill and Valley Forum. You should have said, "Senator, we sell ads."
Yeah.
You remember we did a talk at Hereticon.
Oh,
and
yeah.
we ran a ramp ad
We
during
ran a
the
ramp
talk.
ad during the talk.
We
Yeah.
said,
Wow.
Yeah, I think they paid us a couple $100, which was the highest CPM ever paid for any ad ever, I think, because there were like 50 people in the room. But, it's like a $2,000, $10,000 CPM, but it's a lot of fun. Anyway, let's talk about modernization, Army modernization. What are you reading into what's being put out from the Army, from the DoD, from the government? And are there any companies that are taking advantage of this? It seems like they're very much welcoming Silicon Valley in. I mean, they're on the stream 2 days after we tweeted. It's crazy. But what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, huge cultural shift. If you look at the sort of various branches and how they're known for sort of adopting next generation technologies, at like the tippiest of the spear is basically like the Space Force, sort of subpart of the Air Force. Then next year, traditionally, sort of thought of as the Air Force, then Navy, and then typically Army is more of a thought of, I guess, as like a sort of laggard in terms of really sort of pushing the fold on tech. And so, sort of clearly they're starting to, sort of shift that culture from within. And like, I do think it's like a very bullish signal that Sec Army goes from, seeing that, you guys, are relevant to the tech ecosystem and the Catherine Boyle thing. And obviously the comms team there being like, sir, like you have to, to go get on this. And like to do that in 48 hours is like very not trivial. Like
I don't even know how they got my email. Like I tweeted U.S. Army come on TBPN and they just emailed me in 5 minutes later. It was crazy.
No way.
Crazy.
Yeah, it was wild. They emailed me directly. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's, sort of a lot of, sort of changes and chaos from the new admin. And, like I'm seeing this at a very tactical level with like, sort of portfolio companies where
Totally.
it's like, they're going from, we talked about this plenty of times, but like continuing resolution, reduce budgets to, okay, there's now this reconciliation bill that's, sort of coming in, but then like Congress has to go vote on it. And there's already talk of like, well, maybe they're not going to be super pleased with that reconciliation package in Congress and pass it all. And they're maybe already talking about a fiscal year 26 continuing resolution. So to extend the, sort of current budgetary environment. And so you're seeing that, sort of volatility, sort of show up within individual program offices where there is a little bit of like, sort of retreat to safety of the, sort of pre-existing, sort of programs, pre-existing, sort of contractors, et cetera. And so to have, sort of U.S. Army talking about, hey, even in this budgetary environment, even with all this volatility, that we're, sort of leaning in, sort of on, sort of net new, sort of players and net new technologies, I think is a real, sort of bull signal for the cultural shift that's happening, sort of within the Army. You're seeing that, sort of some amount within other, sort of branches, but like there's sometimes pushback too. I'll give an example that I thought was really interesting. Yesterday, I'm forgetting the exact official. I think he was like a major general, I want to say, within the, sort of Space Force. I'd have to, sort of look up the headline. But he basically, sort of went on stage at a space conference, not Space Symposium, but another one. Anyways, this was like 2 days ago. And basically was like, look, I have a lot of people that keep pitching me on like orbital refueling. We've even funded some orbital refueling companies. I don't think that this gives us any significant advantage anytime soon. The time where this will be relevant to the warfighter is when there's probably a significantly larger number of sort of Space Force satellites up in orbit to justify this. But that's not going to be anytime soon, and is probably a decade away. And so it's kind of interesting to see these like sort of in some ways like counter to what you'd expect. You think Space Force like bleeding edge, adopting the sort of newest technologies, and you have like a major general saying like, we don't think refueling technologies are particular, sort of relevant. And so indicating, hey, maybe the tech ecosystem is like pushing too hard on next generation capabilities before it's relevant. And then you have the Army, which is thought of as being a little stodgier, being like, we want next generation capabilities. People aren't pitching us enough on, sort of this type of stuff. So yeah, those are two, I feel like, sort of, people are reversing seats.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, I feel like the story with the Army was interesting because it wasn't just like IVAS, which is obviously this like debacle that took 30 years, never really got anywhere. Now it's in the hand of Anduril. You can imagine that when Anduril shows up and is like, hey, we're ready for you to buy this, it's going to be pretty good because it's in Palmer Lucky's DNA. And I think he's just like the ego of messing that up would not allow, he would never ship something that doesn't work. Right. But then we also heard that he was like, oh yeah, one of the tech companies that we visited was just Microsoft, because of course we need databases, we need email, we need Excel sheets, probably all these things. And I'm wondering if there will be a next generation. OpenAI was one that he called out as, hey, we get all this data, we can drop LLMs on top of it. And I wonder if there will be kind of a second wave of defense tech where enterprise SaaS companies, as much as we like to joke about, like, let's put the government on ramp, like it really might happen. And there's going to be all the,
yeah, that was something I wanted to ask
for recruiting.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to ask, but we didn't get a chance because we only had it like 10 minutes or so with each. But is there not enough founders in defense tech doing non-kinetic, non-sci-fi, sort of boring, just like effectively, the modern CRM for XYZ,
So
who was the founder we had on that was doing supply chain logistics management? Rune. Yeah. That's one.
Yeah. So Delian, what are you seeing in terms of non-defense tech startups start exploring working with the government in one way or another? I imagine that it's easy to like slap that on as like, oh yeah, we're cool, we have an American flag on the wall. At the same time, there is a real need, and it does seem like there's been some neglect here.
I'm going to do the classic media thing where you ask me a question and I'm going to answer what I want to answer.
Please,
which is
just do whatever.
All blend together.
He's a pro.
It's also a little bit of a ramp ad.
Cool.
Today, Stripe and Ramp announced that they're going to be partnering together to issue stablecoin backed in Latin America.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting to think about, okay, so why LATAM? Why aren't they launching this necessarily US, Europe, et cetera? You can make the arguments on like, hey, we have more currency stability here, so it's not as relevant. There, the value proposition is a lot stronger. But I think it's always interesting to study, if you look at, let's say next generation sort of payment systems, how much is done by like mobile QR codes, tap to pay, et cetera. You actually see that some of the more modern infrastructure is actually in more of the laggard countries, because they don't have this sort of pre-existing, let's say, ACH, wire systems, et cetera, that have been built up over the course of a century. So it makes it harder to fully adopt and switch over. Whereas like in Africa, if you look at like mobile payments, QR codes, et cetera, the like speed of transaction, it's actually like faster and better and lower fee there. But it's because there was no sort of pre-existing, sort of infrastructure or innovation there. They sort of leapfrogged us. You can kind of make the equivalent
greenfield.
Sort of China too, is like it was more of a greenfield. That's why they have the like super apps like WeChat. It's because like they didn't have all of these individual apps that existed before, and so one can come onto the scene with this super app. And so to tie this, sort of into DoD, it's interesting to think about perhaps the places that are going to, in general gov, let's say not DoD alone, perhaps the places that are going to be able to, sort of leapfrog are going to be some of the places that have been the least innovative over the past 20 or 30 years, because they don't have any pre-existing infrastructure or concepts for how do we adopt next generation technologies, right? Within the Air Force, there is the like Air Force Research Laboratory, AFWorks, which is meant to basically, be one of the early funding mechanisms for these next generation technologies. In the Army, you kind of have like Army Futures Command, but it's much less built out of an infrastructure of like, how do we adopt next generation technologies? There isn't like a pre-existing pattern. And so maybe it can be a bit of a leapfrog in a sort of greenfield. And then the equivalent on the like OMB, smart card, et cetera side of things, like, no, I don't think there's been like an RFI for, next generation payment systems for like the Fed and like the corporate card system in the United States in like 30 years. And so in some ways they don't have any like pre-existing biases, infrastructure, et cetera. They can be like, yeah, we're just going to like completely radically rethink, the entire way that we do it, and adopt the stuff from scratch. On like the VC side, am I seeing tons of people working on this? I don't think so. Like, it still feels like it's a little bit of an underexplored trend. I think the biggest thing is more like some of these incumbent companies realizing that there is a real, sort of gov opportunity. So I don't think that you're going to see like next gen corporate card companies start that are focused on the gov. I think where you're going to see is like ramping, like, oh, I didn't even think about the idea that the government could be an adopter of my technology.
Because the whole point of commercial off the shelf is that it's commercial off the shelf. Like if you build it just for the government, you have one buyer and that's a problem. But also it's not going to be as good of a solution as if like, also every Fortune 500 company uses it and you're under immense pressure to deliver the best possible product. Anyway.
Totally. Like, the reason that Ramp is most relevant for them is because it also has all these commercial customers where you can adopt the like best in class, basically like, sort of patterns. And like, I think they talked about, I forget if we talked about this when I went on TBPN during, HVF, I think it was before this panel. But just like the, Senator Ernst and, Eric panel was phenomenal just from the perspective of Eric talking about the like cost savings and efficiencies they were able to improve within Anduril. It's like APB, it just was on the show, Brian Schiff, et cetera, all super, super brilliant people. These are like the best technologists that have like tackled this field. And even for them, Ramp was able to, sort of create significant efficiencies. Imagine what that happens when you get it, get it adopted into the government.
Yeah, well, speaking of Adam Porter Price, he just came on the show. He was breaking down their acquisition of Class, gave us some interesting anecdotes about how the M&A markets work in defense tech. He's not buying a lot of companies that are for sale. He's also not buying a lot of venture-backed companies. What do you think? What are you reading into Anduril's M&A strategy as far as a venture capitalist perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, ABB is a very intelligent acquirer, right? When, I was listening into the last, sort of 5-10 minutes of his, sort of talk, and it's like, look, he goes out and buys things where like there's a clear ability to like go 5-10x their revenues. There's a 1 + 1 = 3, and that like they can build products together within Anduril that the two companies weren't able to apart. And it's somebody that he's like known for years, not something that like when there's a fire sale because the VCs are starting to run out of money, like, then he finally starts to take them seriously. And so, yeah, I don't know. I do think there's a subset of investors that are investing into these defense tech outcomes that think that there is a potential, sort of acquisition M&A option at the end of it. And I don't think there is the equivalent of like, there's definitely these like massive mergers that happen, within, sort of the primes, but you don't see the equivalent of the like, I don't know, like Adobe Figma offer, the Google, sort of Wix, Wiz offer. Like, there's not the equivalent
WhatsApp,
of that.
all of these.
Yeah, where
like looking at it, there was like roughly $3 billion of defense tech funding in 2024. Like, there has to be a bunch of other exit paths. It's not like Anduril is going to be like, oh yeah, we know your fund's coming to a close in 10 years. We're gonna acquire $9 billion worth of venture companies that are at the end of it. Just so we want you guys to get a nice 3x.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is that like I think that it's easy to look at a headline number on some sort of acquisition that happened and think like, oh well, like they were acquired for 3x revenue, so we could that's probably our base case. But when he actually dug into it, he was like, oh, there was this deal, but it was because like Boeing Ventures had invested in this company, and then Boeing bought it, and so there was like total like cyclicality of the deal and like all these special things going on, and it wasn't necessarily just like an open fair price, all financial investors really setting a price in the market. And so there seems to be a lot of distortions in the M&A markets.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give an example that was just announced today in the like aerospace field that sort of matches the negative pattern that APB was suggesting. So it's this company, so Capella Space. It was one of the leaders in the synthetic aperture radar satellite. Think of this as basically like a different spectrum than like Planet Labs that largely focuses on like visual spectrum. This is more like radar based, so you can see through clouds, et cetera.
Clouds, yeah.
They raised like, $320 million total. So right in that, ballpark where APB was saying, once you've raised hundreds of millions, it's really hard to, sort of, go to an M&A outcome. The company was around for like 12, sort of 13 years. In 2022 or 23, suffered a handful of setbacks, both like they had propulsion issues that made some of their satellites end up deorbiting a little more quickly. They unfortunately went on a rocket that ended up having a launch failure. And so that basically satellite went down. Founding CEO ends up having to, sort of resign, and company just sold for what looks like, sort of 320 million, even though the basically, sort of preferred stack was 315. And it sold to this, like, I forget the name of it, but it's like, quantum fund or it was like some quantum related hedge fund that is going to start using their data for sort of hedge fund trading and then try and develop some solutions on it. And so it's like
interesting.
Look, that it basically turns into effectively like a sort of 1x outcome for all the investors if you're selling for your sort of pref stack. And that's sort of like truly the best case outcome that you can sort of get when you're 7 years in. Probably, I assume, flatlining in revenue, still significant, sort of burn. There aren't any obvious like large DoD programs that they were, sort of scaling into. And then you have this like counter example that one of their competitors in the Los Angeles area, Umbra, that has sort of raised less, but I think has taken this much more. I don't know deeply the company's numbers, et cetera, but my just sense is like they've just been way more sort of capital efficient, and they're taking a longer time to sort of build up. but they're doing it in the way that, sort of gives them an outcome on the other side where I do think if, need be, they could get acquired. And if not, I think they can probably run it for a pretty long period of time just on, sort of revenues and cash flows. And so I look at like the defense tech ecosystem and I'm like, man, people are raising large amounts of money and they think like, oh, if I take the Silicon Valley approach of like burn fast, grow fast, et cetera, there will be like a whiz-like outcome on the other side potentially. And it's like, no, like the, sort of M&A space here is like way, 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 way more constrained because unlike Google or like, let's say like, Facebook acquiring Instagram back in the day, there's much less of this like competitive threat by next generation players that grow really, really fast. There's just like not that equivalent dynamic where like you're going to get, sort of bought out even with like relatively limited progress. You're only going to get bought by like these very, very, sort of rational buyers. Not to say that like Facebook's sort of acquisition of Instagram was irrational in the long term, but in that moment, it looked very irrational, right? Like it was a deeply, deeply irrational purchase according to like traditional purchasing, sort of frameworks. I don't think, like APV said, there's going to be that in like the defense, sort of tech ecosystem. They're only going to be very rational purchasers.
Yeah, staying on, I don't know, cameras in space. I was talking to Kevin Wheel from OpenAI, formerly Planet Labs, about observation in VLEO, and he was saying one of the challenges is that orbital refueling and maybe the fact that it's farther away than we think. What is your take? I mean, obviously, you're one of the new LEO, beneficiaries. What's your take on timelines for doing interesting stuff in very low Earth orbit?
Yeah, I do think there's a, sort of real challenge of, if your business case is predicated on a certain mission timeline of like how long you're up there to take photos and generate, sort of revenue. Yeah, there's definitely some interesting folks, Albedo Space is trying to build these very like dense and somewhat aerodynamic, sort of satellites where they're trying to, sort of close this gap between like, hey, if we're lower, we like have slightly better, sort of imaging quality. And if we make this thing somewhat aerodynamic, then we don't, have as bad of like a, sort of deorbit timeline. It just feels like it's, sort of so many technical risks and hurdles where you're trying to like, the way that I feel like Trey sometimes talks about it is like, companies typically should only really rely on like one miracle to get to success. Yeah. These like multi-miracle companies are somewhat difficult. Now, I'm saying that like also, maybe Varda is also a multi-miracle company. It's, non-trivial. But, maybe you're allowed to take a, sort of multi-miracle stab if you're also
we have an American Pope now, so.
Yeah, exactly. So. He's gonna, bless all of us.
Switching gears, can you give us the update on India, Pakistan? I feel like there's these geopolitical conflicts that boil up every once in a while. Sometimes they're just like random rumblings. Sometimes they turn into really huge things. Are you in the nothing ever happens camp or is it so over?
I think we're just going to continue to vacillate back and forth between you. I love this conflict though. Well, no, look, people, I love conflict. Yeah. Sorry. I find this conflict particularly, sort of humorous, even though it's very tragic, sort of for a variety of reasons. The first is if you go to, sort of Columbia University and go interview all of the like, sort of, Hamas affiliated protesters that are storming the library and ask them, sort of which side of the conflict are they on? Who are they rooting for? And who's the aggressor versus who's the, sort of persecuted? They have no idea what to say. They're so confused. Both sides are brown. Like both sides are, kind of, crazy and poor. It's like not very obvious who's the terrorist and who's the terrorized. And so I love that it just like, sort of confuses the like, sort of moral compass of these people that typically have like an, sort of immediate answer. Yeah. The second thing that I love is just like, there's all these just, sort of meme videos. There's this, sort of favorite of mine where, anytime that you see, sort of Indian and Pakistani people, sort of yelling at each other, especially in English when they're arguing, it's always like, you motherfucker, you know, you motherfucker, no, you motherfucker, you know, you the motherfucker. And so I've enjoyed some of those, sort of, meme videos. And then the third is, I do think I can guarantee you Russia, China, the United States are all studying this, conflict very closely because you're seeing a testing of, sort of real bleeding edge systems in a way that like, Russia, Ukraine for sure showed, but the like current sorties that are happening, sort of over India and Pakistan, it's like one, remember that these are both, sort of, nuclear powers. Two, they both have access to like, not current, sort of generation, F-47s that, the current administration is building, but like a generation or two prior, absolutely. Yeah. And there was a recent sortie that supposedly had on the order of like 100 fighter jets that were firing at one another. Now, technically no sides fighter jets, sort of, crossed into, sort of enemy territory, but they were definitely firing missiles at each other.
What's the latest read on actual kills on the fighter side. It seemed like each side was claiming different things. We're also seeing a different dynamic play out with the Houthis, where they've taken down seemingly a large amount of Reapers, that some of which we've confirmed, others we haven't. What's best practices for as a country? Because on one hand, you should be honest with your nation and your fighting forces and say, look, we lost this asset, and hopefully the individual pilot was okay. But on the other hand, it's like you want to be show a sort of maybe you don't want to admit in a conflict like that you're actually taking losses, and so there's kind of like a game theory to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think OSINT is starting to change this a bit, right? So, India was trying to claim that there were no, sort of fighter jet losses that they had on their side. On the Pakistani side, there were photos that are sort of clearly components that are in Pakistani mountain ranges that are of only Indian fighter jets, and so it's like you can't sort of fight against that. I mean, again, maybe people are deep faking these sort of photos, but it's clear that there sort of have been some losses. There was also this example, I think this was only like 3 or 4 days ago now. I'm pretty sure it was an F-14 that was basically trying to land on the Truman and overshot its landing. But a part of why it overshot the landing was because the Truman was taking evasive maneuvers because of Houthi sort of activity, and so. There are people that are more informed than myself on this, but my probably rough estimate would be, I'd bet that there are sort of more fighter jet losses in the past 3 months between United States, India, and Pakistan than there had been amongst those 3 countries in the prior 2 decades combined, or something like that. And so it definitely means that these things are getting trialed out for the first time ever. It's also probably pretty good for the defense primes that build those jets, because I'm sure that they're getting bigger orders. Palmer was talking about this, sort of recently on this interview that he did like 2 or 3 days ago, about how, in order for them to win an F-35 scale program, they have to go public. And so that's probably true, where it's like Anduril, at some point will probably be a beneficiary of some of these things as their Furies start to get into production, and people keep demanding more and more. But if they want to win that size of, sort of human rated platform and program, they probably need to be public. And it's probably pretty good to be Lockheed and Raytheon right now and getting some big orders.
What's your thesis around, Fury is super exciting. You can imagine they scale it up to be bigger, carry bigger payloads, faster, more competitive with, something like an F-35 or an F-47. But does Anduril advance so quickly from an autonomy standpoint that they never have to do a sort of human-enabled platform? Is that just from your personal standpoint, does that feel like a possibility?
They just make them for Tom Cruise in the next Top Gun. That's it. They make exactly one plane. It has the IMAX cameras already baked into it.
It feels like there's just such a strong religion within, sort of the Air Force around, sort of human pilots. And yes, CCA was like a, sort of significant step towards getting them comfortable with like autonomous wingman, but like fully, sort of decoupling for some of these like larger, more capable, more expensive platforms from having like a human operator. That again, I think what happens is like the ratio of autonomous jets to human jets just significantly, sort of increases, I guess, over time, where it's, right now they talk about is like 3 to 4 to 1. And then over time, I think that gets to like 100 to 1. But I think they're still going to want this like human orchestrator that literally just probably has like a literal ball of Furies that are like, operating around the like, sort of fighter, jet pilot. But I would probably bet on, sort of 5 to 1 odds that it's more likely than not, and again, it's hard to, sort of gauge whether or not they win it. I think, Trey and others have talked about, how recently some of the feedback that they get from the department is like they're winning too much. And so, maybe they're not able to win because they're such big winners. But, I'd put like 5 to 1 odds that they definitely like, sort of bid or, architect some human rated, sort of fighter jet system, in the next, call it 5 years.
Yeah.
It's a personal perspective. This is not, internal information.
Of course.
Or speaking on behalf of founders.
Well, while we're on FF portfolio companies, in the news today, Fujisimo going to join OpenAI from Instacart, CEO of applications. Now they have 2 CEOs and running different divisions. Do you have a take about that?
Not co-CEOs.
Not co-CEOs. Are you worried that Will Brewery is going to be poached at some point since Sam just seems to steal the CEOs from all over the market.
Head of space.
What
I know.
are you
Kevin
thinking
Reel,
on
CEO of
the
Planet, now CPO there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, underrated, right? That like the old OpenAI team was incredible, and they all kind of scattered to the wind and started 25 different foundation model companies. But now he's putting together the Avengers again. It's great.
And, not to be rude to the prior, V1 Avengers, but I think the V2 Avengers are a little more sane, commercially focused, and a little more stable. I think the V1 was probably right for like the research lab days, where you
Totally.
had to be a little crazy. Now
Totally.
that's it's a commercial company, probably a little different. I don't know. I mean, there's so much news that I feel like has come out of OpenAI over the past week that I do think fundamentally changes how you should like underwrite the company over the next sort of 5 years, where it seems like they're sort of abandoning the full for-profit conversion.
Sure.
It seems like Microsoft is not necessarily fully willing to give up their like rev share and percent of the revenue they get at these like larger scales that they were originally promised, and so that negotiation is clearly not done. And then in Sam's announcement, sort of tweet, he was like, by the way, I am staying on as CEO of OpenAI, even though this person is CEO of applications. It's like, well, nobody was asking that question, but like, given that you're clarifying, maybe we should be asking that, sort of question.
It made me think, we had O3 explain ChatGPT's entity structure the other
Or
day.
OpenAI's structure.
OpenAI, and it could not. It was like explain it
very
like on
difficult.
5, and it was extremely botched. You came away even more confused. So we don't have.
We haven't passed that Turing test
The real
yet.
AGI is
when it's going to
is real
explain
AGI.
the structure of
being able to
OpenAI.
explain your own corporate structure.
Yeah.
But I just read into that as like, maybe Sam is CEO of one entity in the stack, and then OpenAI Global LLC has another.
Yeah.
Because they're not like co-CEOs.
Sure,
At
sure,
no
sure.
point did it say that. So.
Yeah, I mean, you've been a little bit negative on wrappers, on companies building on top of on foundation models, and yet another FF portfolio company, Windsurf, acquired by OpenAI, $3 billion outcome. It seems like
I don't think Windsurf is a portfolio company, by the way. Maybe it is.
we looked that up.
Reported.
It's publicly reported. I don't know how that would be the case. We missed that when we saw that.
I found it on 3 different.
Maybe it's fake news. Who knows?
It could be
but,
fake
but,
news.
But the big thing is is it game on for application layer companies now, given that you can go and raise a very traditional venture path, and the narrative of like, oh, you're just going to get steamrolled might not be there, because $3 billion is $3 billion. It's a pretty good outcome, right?
I mean, look, this is the perfect example of the delta between sort of defense tech companies and AI tech sort of companies.
Yeah.
Like, one, there is the like, hey, I'm the big company with lots of cash, I feel slightly threatened. The like exponential growth of these things can sometimes be inescapable, and so therefore I need to buy this and have like a player in the race.
Yep.
And then on the defense tech side of things, there is no such thing as like uncontrolled exponential, sort of growth. In some ways, the government explicitly like meters your progress where they want you to see you accomplish XYZ thing on a smaller program is a lily pad to the larger program, et cetera. And so it's like, yes, Anduril has done super well, but if you compare them to the like exponential revenue growths of the like OpenAIs, the ramps, et cetera, of the world, I don't think it's that. It still is like super linear, but there is some like natural cap on like true sort of growth rate. And so I do think it then makes it more rational for investors to be piling into some of these AI application companies. Like, look, I still I'm probably not a bull on things like Harvey as an example, not to like overly pick on them. But when I think about like again, not to pick overly on another company, but if I were to think about like the irrationality of some of the like Harvey prices versus the Saronic prices, at least with Harvey you can rationalize, hey, there are these like multi-billion-dollar acquisition outcomes that are almost certainly going to happen quite regularly. I don't know like who buys Saronic, right? Like I don't think that like Electric Boat, the General Atomic subsidiary, et cetera, is buying, Saronic for their shipyards for $3 billion. Like,
yeah. It's totally possible that the Windsurf thing causes this cascade of like every hyperscaler needs an IDE company, and it's just like boom, 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 and they all have $10 billion to spend. So is $10 billion too much? Maybe $2 billion happens, but like multi-billion-dollar outcomes, we could see a whole bunch of those. Same thing with image generation. Same thing with different agent models. Like there's a way that like a lot of these could be baked into things. Anyway,
I think the other question I'd be interested to get your point of view on. So we were at Config yesterday. Figma came out with Make, Sites, Buzz, like a bunch of like very, things that could be by themselves their own kind of businesses, right? And I saw some commentary online that was basically saying that like every app is just like basically converging on the same feature set right now. It feels like in some ways where it's just like make anything, you know? And so like like in your point of view, obviously you very clearly took you shifted away from looking at a lot of pure software opportunities, but how do you think VCs will change in kind of underwriting some of these opportunities where for some businesses that have been started in the last year, they're moving towards a place where everyone is weirdly competing over the same kind of like core use case at the end of the day, make an app, make, XYZ, thing.
Yeah, I'll use a like example from more like backend, sort of cloud infrastructure that was related to AI. There was all this hype in like 21 and 22 around, and I may butcher this because again, not my field, but I believe is the term was basically these vector sort of databases that were a way of basically storing a lot of the sort of model weights, the sort of pre-training sort of data that you were sort of working with, and you're fine-tuned basically models on top of the sort of base foundation models. There was a whole set of investors that plowed like hundreds of millions of dollars into these companies. They had crazy revenue growth. And then like within 12 months, AWS made it a feature, Google Cloud made it a feature, Azure made it a feature.
Yeah.
And the companies basically just dropped off to zero because it was like, yeah, this is just a natural cloud feature. Thanks so much for pointing it out. Thank you, VCs, for like funding hundreds of millions of dollars to like, make, our customers very aware that this was necessary. But it turns out like people just like having things in a single platform that they already have a relationship with. And so yeah, I think like, if I were, sort of, Dylan, the CEO of Figma, I would just be like studying what all these VCs are funding and then being like, great, I don't even need to buy this. This is so easy for my internal team to build that I will just go build the best applications. And then it turns out the CFO is like, well, why would we have two design software contracts? We already use Figma. It's already rolled out to everybody. Everybody knows how to do it. Let's just kill this AI thing and just like, use the AI up within Figma. And so I think that like, I don't know if you guys remember this term Sherlocking. It was, this is for the, sort of viewers on the show that are, below the age of 30. Back in the day, there was this app on the Mac App Store called Sherlock that, was very popular. Some VCs funded it. It was getting to like millions of sort of revenue. All that it did was if you hit Command Space, it pulled up a little search bar and allowed you to search all your applications, et cetera, on your Mac app. And then
cool
one day,
feature.
then one day at WWDC, Apple was like, "Hey, that's a cool idea. We're just making it like an OS feature." And so and on, it was known as getting Sherlocked when a big tech company just releases your entire company as a free feature in the like software that they already have all the distribution on. And so
yeah, I mean, I always looked at a lot of these generate an app companies and looking at their revenue ramps, it should be nerve-wracking if your revenue is ramping that quickly and there are founder mode incumbents that are in the same category, because usually means you can build said thing very quickly. But anyways,
this is fantastic. Thank you so much
Great
for
to have
hopping
you on.
We'll talk to you soon. Delta V, Delian, that's the end of that.
Godspeed.